Gilded Age. Okay, ready? This is hard. The Gilded Age. A time when the ridiculously wealthy prospered and the working class was left behind. Are we in that era again? What's the same and what's different? We're going to be diving into that today. Hi, my name is Dorielle.
And I'm Shane. We met and fell in love working at a history museum.
We both pursued history in college, and we really don't have much to show for it.
We decided to start this channel to combat the widespread misinformation being churned out all over the internet, and use our highly overpriced degrees for a good cause.
That way, we didn't do all that work.
For nothing. We got the idea for this episode quite a while ago, when the current administration talked about how they wanted to make America great again, citing the Gilded Age.
You know, our country was the strongest, believe it or not, from 1870 to 1913.
But was America truly great during the Gilded Age? And if so, for who? Before we dive in, let's define the Gilded Age. According to historians, the Gilded Age spanned from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century. It was a time of unprecedented industrial growth, extreme wealth, and extreme poverty.
And we mean extreme poverty. Of the 12 million families that were living in the United States at the time, 11 million of them were barely making ends meet. Meanwhile, the top 10% were imitating European aristocracy, building lavish castles, holding enormous themed balls, all while enhancing their wealth by buying politicians and monopolizing critical industries.
Now, unpopular opinion here, but I think wealth inequality is a bad thing. I think it's a sign of a bad society when you have some people dying of hunger, while others, like railroad industrialist Diamond Jim Brady, would, according to his biographer, eat 2 lobsters, deviled crabs, clams, oysters, and beef, along with 2 whole pies for dessert. And that was just for lunch. For dinner, he would have a couple dozen oysters, 6 crabs, and bowls of green turtle soup as his appetizer. For the main course, he would eat 2 whole ducks, 6 or 7 more lobsters, a sirloin steak, vegetables, and topped it off with pastries and a 5-pound box of chocolates. Now, an alternative, pro-dying of hunger argument comes to us from PragerU. Just kidding. Kind of.
This video has it all. A snarky Karen-looking woman who looks like she has some very strong opinions of estate taxes, telling you that the Gilded Age was actually great. A bizarre example that sums up the whole video is when it suggests railroads brought farmers who were sick of the plow to the cities like they were in an 80s movie, and they were going to the big city to be a big star. In reality, it was far more likely that the farmer was going to the big city because the railroad caused food prices to fall and they were forced to sell their land, very likely to a railroad.
A major misconception of the Gilded Age is the idea that industrial titans produced major innovations that improved people's lives. PragerU wants you to believe that without these wealthy robber barons, as they were called, America would not have moved forward into the modern functioning society it is today. In reality, these capitalists had a small role in the actual creation or operation of the technologies that changed the country. Their immense fortune was accumulated largely by exploiting the substantial output generated by their workers. I blame the History Channel a lot for this idea, with their stupid Men Who Built America series, which, yes, of course, I watched.
Let's use Andrew Carnegie, a steel magnate, as an example. Now, Carnegie knew that America was about to experience an industrial boom, and knew that what was going to be needed for this was steel. So he buys land and has a steel manufacturing plant built. He then employs laborers to process raw materials into steel beams that he will later profit off of. Carnegie was not the one laboring. He was not smelting this metal at thousands of degrees in a hot and unsafe factory, but he was the one directly profiting from their tireless efforts. These employees would sometimes be working 24 hours a day in 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. So, without Carnegie, they want you to believe that steel wouldn't have been produced. This is a baseless argument, and one that normalizes wealthy people exploiting labor for their own obscene profit. The video's assumption that innovation and an increase of quality of life is connected to the success of the stupidly wealthy is a non sequitur and historically dishonest. PragerU cherry-picks data from a time period far outside the Gilded Age to make a point about trickle-down economics, Reagan's wet dream, to then conveniently leave out the fallout from the disastrous policies in 1929. This is why cherry-picking history and not providing context is very harmful.
Also, contrary to what PragerU would have you believe, wages in the heart of the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1880, actually dropped, only to rise again because of the blood, sweat, and tears of laborers. Wages today have stayed relatively stagnant, with most of the growth concentrated on the top 10% of earners. Since the Reagan administration, people who earn the federal minimum wage have seen their buying power steadily decrease.
But no, in PragerU's mind, if it wasn't for those genius innovators, most of whom didn't actually invent anything, Thomas Edison, we wouldn't have the infrastructure that we have today. Basically, rich people good, so none of those pesky regulations, and poor people can suck it up and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Blah, blah, blah. This reimagining of the Gilded Age does nothing but serve the interest of people that want to keep us in our current Gilded Age. And yes, we are in a Gilded Age, a long one. In many ways, what we are experiencing now is a more extreme version of the Gilded Age of the 19th century. The first thing that is similar is the obvious wealth inequality. Today, the top 10% of households own 60% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom half only own 6%. Since 2020 alone, wealth inequality worldwide has skyrocketed. For example, Elon Musk's wealth has gone from an already unfathomable $24.6 billion in 2020 to almost $400 billion in 2025. That's a whopping 152% increase in just 5 years.
In comparison, Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 with an estimated net worth of $105 million. In today's money, that's a measly $3 billion. So the wealthiest earners now own significantly more than their inconceivably rich predecessors. So really we might be in something even worse, like a super Gilded Age, or maybe like a deep Gilded Age. Would that work? The long, deep Gilded Age? No, that doesn't work.
No.
To demonstrate this, first, we will examine the life-altering technologies that have epitomized the two eras. Then turn our attention to the new kind of debaucherous capitalist that sprang forth. Finally, we will look at the corrupt nature and devastating consequences of imagined wealth and speculation, things that ruin our life pretty much on a daily basis. And then we'll talk about how we're able to get out of the first Gilded Age, and what tools we can borrow to dig our way out of this one.
The Gilded Age began a shift in American culture where corporations had more and more control over people's lives. Corporations and private equity seem inescapable to us today, but prior to industrialized capitalism, people could go their whole lives without interacting with a corporation once. Sounds nice, right? Eventually, however, corporations owned people's time, how they lived, how long they worked, and sometimes even where they lived. Company towns sprang around the big industrial cities and mining towns at a rate never seen before, sometimes paying workers in company currency to be redeemed at the company store. Oh, and fun fact, Disney is actually doing those right now. So magical.
Furthermore, people who once got their necessities from their neighbors now relied on increasingly powerful and impersonal corporations. This trend shattered communities across the country. Tenement housing sprang up in cities, but their residents were more focused on survival rather than forming bonds with their neighbors, which you had a lot of. Sometimes up to 14 adults lived in one room. These places were truly awful. To give you an idea, the 1867 Tenement House Act had a requirement in it of one toilet per 20 people. 20! And that law was supposed to help. The innovation most synonymous with the Gilded Age, and one that changed the country forever, was railroads. It's common to compare railroads with the more modern invention of the internet, and the comparison is indeed accurate. The concept of time as we know it was birthed by the time schedules utilized by trains. Railways really led to the idea of time is money like never before. Previously, the average person's schedule was more broad. Their day was divided into 3 parts: sun up, midday, and sundown. Time was more directed by nature rather than machines. People's concept of distance was also smaller and more localized. In the 1850s, crossing the country was a matter of months. By the 1880s, it was only a matter of days. Furthermore, before railroads, goods and necessities were often bought in your town by someone you could have known your entire life, who had a special skill and provided a valuable service, like shoes being made by a shoemaker. Industrialization broke the bond between the buyer and seller, and now almost all trade is done by complete strangers. This trade-off between convenience and connection is expanded upon in modern e-commerce, where buyers can make a transaction without ever having to leave their house. Even sites like eBay or Etsy that had some small personal touches were eventually co-opted by big tech capitalists. Interpersonal connections during travel were also disrupted by the rise of locomotives. Previously, traveling by carriage often took weeks, encouraging lively banter with fellow passengers. The speed of trains made this custom decline rapidly. It seemed like feelings of community were eroding everywhere. Sound familiar? The two innovations also warped concepts of reality. For Gilded Age Americans, it was how towns and cities were actually built. On the East Coast, where cities were built before the advancement of railroads, the lines were constructed to connect already established towns to each other. However, in the western half of the country, towns were built around the railroad, with their survival being dependent on the success of the road itself. In modern times, the line between reality and the digital world continues to blur, with attention being worth its weight in gold. Instagram generated almost $60 billion last year in ad revenue alone. Furthermore, AI is booming, with Nvidia possessing a $3 trillion market share. The increase in production mostly benefited the wealthy, in particular stockholders, who made an insane profit off these new technologies. Similar to the early days of the internet, railroads were inadequately regulated. Competing railroads were often laid next to each other, with trains headed to the same destination. Rates for shipping people and goods were set arbitrarily, often changing without notice. Government subsidies and foreign investment were stolen by railroad magnates using the bare minimum funds to lay down track. The goal of these tycoons was to exact as much money as possible from the railroad venture to advance their own personal wealth, while construction became an afterthought. No line exemplified this more than the scarlet woman of the industry, the Erie Railroad.
In both the Gilded Age and our modern tech era, successful capitalists possessed a vulgar, depraved attitude towards business dealings. A great example from the first Gilded Age is the actions of Jay Gould, a railroad tycoon. In 1868, Gould swindled Vanderbilt by selling the Commodore fraudulent stock in the Erie Railroad. This incident, later named the Erie War, started when Vanderbilt tried to silently buy the valuable rail line, which stretched from New York City to Lake Erie. He believed he could use his massive fortune to inevitably become the majority shareholder. Control of the line would give Vanderbilt a monopoly on goods moving by rail from the prosperous farms of the Great Lakes down the Hudson River to the New York Harbor. In response, Jay Gould, along with other notorious speculators, Jim Fisk and Daniel Drew, devised a plan. They illegally printed illegitimate stock and sold it to Vanderbilt, eventually stealing $7 million. When the Commodore realized he had been deceived, he utilized crooked judges to issue injunctions, stopping the sale, and even had an arrest warrant put out for Gould, Fisk, and Drew. The three men allegedly escaped to New Jersey in a rowboat with the fortune on board.
Everything is legal in New Jersey.
From there, the arrest warrant had no jurisdiction, and the trio launched a counterattack using their own collection of bribed judges and politicians. The Erie War came to a conclusion when the crafty thieves agreed to return the money in exchange for Vanderbilt giving up his pursuit of the railroad. Historian Michael Hiltzig, in his book Iron Empires, Robber Barons, Railroads, and the Making of Modern America, often refers to the exploits of the Gilded Age capitalists as seeking plunder, invoking the imagery of pirates. The story of Gould, Fisk, and Drew fleeing the law in a rowboat with stolen treasure kind of matches this idea perfectly. The public read the details of the Erie War with a horrified curiosity. Such crude immorality and brazen criminal behavior towards one's competitors was not common even amongst the most successful businessmen of the time. To top it all off, Gould and Fisk would eventually force Daniel Drew out of the company using the same method they used against Vanderbilt. Drew was an especially infamous swindler. Legend has it the phrase watered stock, where the value of a stock is artificially inflated, comes from when he sold cattle and would feed them salt before they were weighed so they would hold more water. Despite screwing him over, Drew and Vanderbilt had an interesting frenemies kind of relationship. Think Gossip Girl if they talked like they were in gangs in New York.
Who makes this peace with me? I'm hearing confession tonight, you mother Irish. Whose man are you? We speak English in this country. Whose man are you? You see this knife? I'm gonna teach you to speak English with this knife.
These new robber barons were viewed as unsophisticated scoundrels by the old money families, especially in New York, even though most of them were just sophisticated scoundrels with rich parents. It's been said that the famous Astor-Vanderbilt feud began when the old tycoon spit his tobacco plugs onto the Astor's expensive carpet. Jim Fisk became the subject of ridicule when he paraded around in an increasingly gaudy army uniform after being given the command of a National Guard regiment, undeservingly. Keep in mind, Fisk was no veteran. His role during the Civil War was to acquire cotton from rebels' territory occupied by the Union and send it north. This is how he made his first fortune. Fisk's antics got him nicknames like Jubilee Jim and Barnum of Wall Street. New York became flooded with the ruthlessly ambitious nouveau riche, who used the city's social scene mostly as like a Victorian dick measuring contest.
A similar clash took place during the internet era. A famous example is Travis Kalanick, the former CEO of Uber. His, let's say, casual style did not mesh well with the wealthy business elites of the time. Kalanick claimed an investor said he would kill him if he did not change his decorum while representing the company in public. Fisk and Kalanick's eccentric and frequently reckless behavior are viewed as cautionary tales. Fisk, a major patron of Broadway, met his demise after a torrid and well-publicized affair with New York actress Josie Mansfield. Accusations of Mansfield engaging in sex work and the appearance of another admirer, Ned Stokes, heightened the drama and made the story front-page news. Complicating matters further, Fisk had cheated Stokes out of an oil refinery and was using his crooked judges to have his rival indicted. Stokes sought retribution. On January 6, 1872, Stokes waited for Fisk in the stairwell of the Grand Central Hotel and shot him twice. The only people by his side were Jay Gould and the notorious New York politician, Boss Tweed. Several of Fisk's acquaintances were in the lobby of the hotel taking bets on how much longer Jubilee Jim had to live. He was 36 years old. Kalanick likewise had a well-publicized downfall in 2017 after a salacious tenure as CEO of Uber, an idea he did not create. Unlike Fisk, he began his career in the lower-stakes world of pirating data, specifically music, which resulted in him being sued by major recording studios. After selling another online venture, Kalanick spent some of his millions on a San Francisco party house known as his Jam Pad.
Called it, quote, his jam pad. Jam pad?
His exploits intensified with the rapid success of Uber. It was discovered in 2014 company executives, Kalanick included, frequented escort bars on business trips to South Korea, an accusation he tried to cover up by getting the senior vice president of business to call his then-girlfriend and ask her to say it was just a karaoke bar if anyone asked, a request she soundly refused. One of Kalanick's most illicit scandals was when he acquired the self-driving car company Otto. He knew the majority of Otto staff were Google employees and that would piss Google off, and he knew its founder, Anthony Lewandowski, had stolen Google data in his possession. Despite this, Uber paid almost $700 million for the startup, placed Lewandowski at the head of its self-driving vehicle program, and protected him from the inevitable legal retaliation. Kalanick also constantly displayed erratic behavior that was sometimes captured in videos posted online. These incidents only got worse as information about Uber's extremely toxic work culture got out. The final straw was when a video was released of him angrily arguing with an Uber driver over the cost of owning a car and working for the company.
I lost $97,000 because of you. I bankrupt because of you.
Look.
Yes.
You know what?
You keep changing every day.
What have
You keep changing
Hold on a
every
second.
day.
What have I changed about black?
Expected price cuts were only going to make this worse. Kalanick later argued with the same driver again, and this time tried to buy him off with Uber stock. The company's board was done with him and he was fired. Well, actually, the 5 major investment firms that had money in Uber asked him to resign. What a time to be alive. What a totally not sterile, not dystopian time to be alive. While many recoiled at the apparent lack of morality demonstrated by tycoons of their respective eras, others saw a hedonistic lifestyle that offered the prospect of a rapid rise of wealth and status. The out-of-control lust for riches exemplified by railroad tycoons would eventually lead to economic disaster. The early 2000s saw the rise of the tech bro, typically an immature 20-something upper-middle to upper-class white man with enough coding knowledge to dazzle their older Luddite investors. Now, a legion of vulgar, casually dressed, socially inept baby capitalists with a win-at-all-cost mentality has flooded Silicon Valley in a headlong pursuit for the same thing that motivated Vanderbilt, Fisk, Gould, and Drew nearly 150 years earlier. Plunder.
Prior to the Civil War, the New York Stock Exchange was not the behemoth of finance that we know today. Its members often made rules in a sort of gentleman's agreement with very little outside regulation. Massive government subsidies in industries like weaponry and railroads expanded the number of valuable publicly traded companies. This deregulated arena, now flush with cash, was dominated by the most piratical speculators like Gould and Fisk. These two really were the dynamic duo of greed at the time. They even tried to corner the gold market through insider trading. Yeah, they really wanted to hoard the nation's gold like they were dragons or something. These trades would happen in the Gold Room on Wall Street that featured an indoor fountain with a gilded statue of Cupid cavorting with a dolphin. So yeah, safe to say the stock market was made for rich people, by rich people. The blatant inequality is confirmed by current data. The top 10% own 93% of all stocks, while the top 1% own 50% today. The top earners are now moving more of their wealth outside of the public sector every day, which changes the game for anyone that is not in that class. 29.2% of the market is now in the private sector for the first time, edging out the public sector, which is at 28.5%. Stock manipulation was curtailed in the early decades of the 20th century. However, these avaricious tactics came back in full circle under the deregulating policies of, you guessed it, Ronald Reagan. In the time since, the stock market has returned to its normal place as an unstable feeding frenzy for only the most cutthroat traders. In both eras, wealth that often only existed on paper was used to consolidate more power. Famously, Elon Musk purchased the social media platform Twitter, using his Tesla stocks as collateral. Gould and Fisk similarly expanded their railroad empire with the stocks of previously purchased railroads. And they never changed the name of the railroad, by the way, unlike someone else we know. In both time periods, purchasing the compliance of politicians to advance shareholders' interests was commonplace. In the Gilded Age, it was a matter of out-and-out bribery with cash or oftentimes with stock. Today, it is the farcical dance of lobbying, which is bribery in all but name. The credit mobilier scandal of the 1860s was the most famous example of the time and included politicians all the way up to the vice president, Schuyler Colfax. Credit mobilier was essentially the Union Pacific Railroad taking advantage of the government's funding of the Transcontinental Railroad to ensure profit. Because much of the West had not been colonized yet, the actual Transcontinental Railroad would not make a profit through operations for years. Instead, the company's executives hired a fraudulent construction management firm, gave it a very French-sounding name, and funneled government subsidies through it to shareholders in the form of dividends. The process was relatively standard practice in the railroad industry. The only difference with credit mobilier was its scale and that the information was made so public. The fallout from the scandal in the Panic of 1873 the following year sank the Union Pacific, and it was later swooped up by Gould, who unsurprisingly used and abused the line to enrich himself. Oakes Ames, a representative from Massachusetts, testified before Congress about the details of the scheme and named several of his colleagues. In the end, however, the mostly Republican investigatory committee decided to censure Ames and the only Democrat named in the scandal. While many of the accused politicians lost their jobs through failed re-election or resignation, jail time was never on the table. In modern day, corruption has risen to an unsettling degree. A crypto pump-and-dump scheme revolving around the current president's meme coin involved several members of Congress, all of whom made small fortunes off of the venture. Corruption is ubiquitous in politics today. Longtime Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi has greatly benefited through trades and industries her position obviously has influence over. Her exploitation is so well known, an EFT, or collection of stocks from different businesses, exists specifically to mimic her trades. The 85-year-old Congresswoman made $4.7 million from trades in a single day this year. In both eras, these crooked politicians were under the guise that their actions were completely acceptable. Quote, "There is no law and no reason, legal or moral, why a member of Congress should not own stock in a road any more than why he should not own a sheep when the price of wool is to be affected by the tariff," said Ames in his testimony. In our modern times, corruption has gone off the rails, har har. A great example of this being the current sitting president accepting a $400 million palace in the sky from a foreign adversary. Famous Gilded Age politician George Plunkett called this unabashed profiteering an honest graft.
Nowadays, your money in the bank is insured by the government. In an economic crash, you get your money back. Bank robbery, you get your money back. Bank burns down, you get your money back. Before this, your money was as secure as the bank that was holding it. In other words, if the bank failed, your money went with it. So if the economy looked like it was going south, you rushed to the bank to pull your money out. This is called a panic. In this time period alone, there were 5 panics. Even before the credit mobilier scandal became publicized, the railroad market was dangerously oversaturated. Entered the 1873 panic and the 6-year depression that followed. Similar to the 2008 housing crisis, a major financial firm failed. A very major financial firm in this case. Jay Cooke of Jay Cooke & Company was the major financier of the Civil War. He even kept the economy from spiraling after Lincoln was assassinated. However, Cooke's investment in the second transcontinental railroad, the Northern Pacific, set off a chain reaction with all the other firms with money invested in railroads. Just to give you an example of how saturated the market was, when a representative from Cook and Company went to D.C. to bribe a member of Congress with stock in the Northern Pacific, the politician turned him down, and then proceeded to try to sell him stock in another railroad. J. Cook and Company declared bankruptcy on September 18th of 1873. European investors started selling their holdings in railroads, and the panic spread across the country. The situation was dire, and the government had a choice of bailing out common citizens or narrowing its relief to large financiers. President Ulysses S. Grant took an ineffective middle path, issuing greenbacks, or government IOUs, and vetoing bills that would have put more gold into circulation. While limiting inflation, these policies were to the detriment of ordinary Americans. An astounding 18,000 businesses, including 89 railroads, failed in just 2 years. Unemployment rose to 14%. For decades afterwards, this is what Americans went when they talked about the Great Depression. Contrary to what the PragerU video mentioned, robber barons used this economic downturn to slash employment and cut wages. The economic hardship and stories of corruption created resentment in the minds of voters. The Republicans were crushed in the 1874 midterms. Once Democrats took control of Congress, they dismantled support for Reconstruction, and the South was turned back over to white supremacists. General Grant was viewed as a savior of the Union militarily, and many believed President Grant would be its savior politically, but he failed. Instead, he joined a long line of American presidents whose foolish commitment to the economic status quo derailed their more high-minded objectives. Working people would have to rely on themselves to reclaim the dignity stolen from them by capitalists. Before the panic, many workers on railroads saw their profession as both well-paid and hypermasculine. In the years that followed, most realized they were expendable, and the wealth they generated for tycoons such as Vanderbilt and Gould would never trickle down to them. Their only recourse now was active resistance against their ineffectual bosses. The railroad strike of 1877 was the first step out of the Gilded Age and into an age where workers realized their power.
Now, while it's good to question history in the way that it is taught, I think we can agree PragerU is interpreting the era for the few, while we are attempting to interpret it for the many, aka the people who do the hard labor. We would like to pitch an alternative time period for when we think the Gilded Age really ended. We argue that it really ended in 1877 with the first of many railroad strikes. Between 1880 and 1900, there were 37,000 strikes across the country. The national labor movement is often tied in with the Gilded Age when taught in history class, but we believe this time period should belong to the workers. The Gilded Age is the time period before people inevitably began fighting back. We propose from 1877 to the turn of the 20th century should then be designated as the labor uprising movement. The Gilded Age is the chaotic, decadent time period before the working class realized their true potential and exercised their collective power. Citing the Gilded Age as being from the end of the Civil War to the start of the 20th century diminishes the impact working class people played on the country's rapid growth. Saying that prominent figures of this era were the sole generators of wealth and progress, while ignoring the rampant corruption and exploitation, is an erroneous assessment. It is more accurate to say that these men sold a solution to a problem they directly caused. Like snake oil salesmen, these tycoons peddled potential, concealed side effects, and profited heavily and avoided any consequences. The people left in the wake of these charlatans had only one option: resistance. In a desperate effort to improve pay and working conditions, laborers from across industries rallied to unions nationwide. For the rest of the 19th century, strikes were brutally crushed by corporations with the support of the state militias and federal troops. Many of these strikes were more reminiscent of pitched battles than the mostly peaceful demonstrations we see today. The United States government treated the American labor movement with nothing short of intense hostility until the progressive Teddy Roosevelt unexpectedly became the nation's chief executive in 1901. That time period when the working class fought insurmountable odds against greedy and capricious capitalists should have a name that recognizes their sacrifice. In the final decade of the 19th century, many exploited groups joined together together to form the People's Party, or the Populists. This party captured state houses across the country and even won a few electoral votes in the presidential election of 1892. This organization of the popular will forced ambitious politicians like William Jennings Bryan to adopt policies that were important to everyday people. Victories came in increments. The insanely wealthy continued to be insanely wealthy. Thousands of people died fighting for radical ideas, like, I don't know, the weekend, women's suffrage, an 8-hour workday, and to maybe end child labor. Oh, also, maybe one toilet per 20 people. Too much to ask for? For most of the 20th century, America instituted policies that learned from the desperation and avarice of the Gilded Age. Policies that understood ignorance and poverty were the enemy of a good society. We have moved dramatically away from that ideal and have stagnated as a nation because of it.
An optimistic perspective of our current situation is that we too have moved past this second or long Gilded Age into our own labor uprising movement. Following the pandemic in 2020, union membership saw a bump, its first in decades. Many Americans, in the wake of COVID, have gained class consciousness and are directing their animosity appropriately towards the ruling class. Mass coordinated efforts to boycott the most culpable corporations have yielded results, especially in the cases of Target, Tesla, and Starbucks. However, a more pessimistic view would point to the increasingly egregious corruption present throughout the government, and the growing power of corporations and the billionaire class coalescing into the dangerous mobilization of fascists across the country. Strikes and protests are important, but it's all things we've seen before. The determination of workers during the labor uprising movement was unprecedented and persisted through a savage retaliation by the state. Today's movements tend to fizzle out. That bump in union membership in 2020 is already gone, and membership is again at an all-time low. Furthermore, another critical tool against the ruling class during the Gilded Age was the growth of investigative journalism, known at the time as muckraking. The Credit Mobilier scandal came to light through the work of the New York Sun. Ida Tarbell's tireless work led to the dissolution of Standard Oil and the exposure of its founder, infamous robber baron John D. Rockefeller. Today, journalism as a practice is at a serious low point. Most major news outlets discovered it was easier and more profitable to side with the ruling class than expose them to the public. Remember Travis Kalanick? His biggest supporter on the Uber board was Arianna Huffington of the liberal Huffington Post. And don't get me started on Jake fucking Tapper. While it can all seem overwhelming, there is a way forward. The modern robber barons and their bootlicking sidekicks possess a distinct image particularly desirable to sad, lonely, and desperate men. Those who fight for collective liberation must form their own distinct culture to counteract this insipid manipulation. It was during the Gilded Age that many Americans began to identify as working class and took pride in the knowledge that it was their effort that moved the country forward. Ideals of solidarity, equality, and dignity fueled the change. Also, people committed to changing the country must find safe and convenient third spaces to share ideas and to organize. These spaces have been critical to all revolutions and are more difficult to find than ever. It will take more effort and more organization than in the past, but it must be done. The things we take for granted today, like the weekend and not having to share a toilet with 19 other people, did not come from the generosity of rich people or from some magical invisible hand. Ordinary people fought and died for it. And month after month, year after year, decade after decade, they never quit. They never stopped demanding better. It was the only way out then, and it's the only way out now.
This video only covers a fraction of the tumultuous events that shaped this era. The genocide of the Native Americans and the collapse of Reconstruction, just to name a few. They could honestly be their own videos. Also, we know that this is a lot of economic history, talking about the stock market and boardrooms and gross shit like that. But we need to be in that space because it is not great.
So many finance bros.
So many finance bros.
It's very gross on that side of YouTube.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you can tell, but this is our first scripted video. It took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and reworking and staying up late nights. It felt like we were in college again.
It did.
Yeah.
I actually really enjoyed it. It kind of gave me that same thrill that writing papers did in college. So
yeah.
I liked it.
Well, let us know what you think below. I think going forward, this is going to be the format.
So don't forget, try to find our own working class culture. I think a lot of the things I see with leftists is that they try to grab from other eras.
Yeah.
And you really need to kind of make one that's of this era.
Absolutely.
You need to make your own culture that says what we feel and represents how we feel today. And then we really need third spaces. It's so hard to find third spaces nowadays. Like coffee shops, bars, pubs, anything like that is just very tough because you got to drive to it. You got to make time for it. It's not the way it has been in centuries past.
But it's not impossible.
Not impossible. And we need to make more of an effort, but it needs to get done. Finally, it's just never stop.
Don't stop talking about it, no matter what they say. One of the biggest pieces of advice that I think I have gotten is do not obey in advance.
Yes.
Keep speaking out. Be your own muckraker. Speak out about the atrocities that you see every day, and don't allow the manipulation of the fascist right telling you that what's happening in front of your eyes isn't happening get to you. It is happening, and we are living through unprecedented times. But something that I want everyone to remember is the future is ahead of you.
Like, share, subscribe.
We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Monopolists.